Oddly never bibliographic.
It's really complicated. I'm glad I did. I can put it on my.
And then a meta description for using a schema that we create. I've done that in a metadata class and in
My joining just did that this quarter also.
get to digitize our
Oh, we did.
Hey there.
Looks so much more impressive up here.
Nice.
I use like Disney objects so I had to like grab and describe using our schema. It's my schema.
All right, folks, I think we're going to get started in a second. Thanks for coming. I think Lynn is shepherding people in the back there.
That is terrible. Why wouldn't
I don't
It's like, I think we just advanced this.
may not?
I think that's all. Yeah. I was like, wait. All right, folks, I think we're going to get started for this session. Welcome back, everyone. And we're going to start our final panel of the day. Before I start, I just wanted to say if you haven't had a chance to get to the Manuscript exhibition in the Lee Library, totally worthwhile to stop by. There'll be time after this. And then immediately following this session will be a tour of the exhibit that some of you have seen, but others have not. The dot porter will lead. And for those of you on Zoom, I hear there'll be a walk-along, I don't know if someone has a GoPro on their head, but it's a tour through it. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this session of the Symposium today. Two great papers to wrap up today's session. I'll start with Dr. Paul Love, who's our first speaker. He's a distinguished scholar of North African manuscript cultures. We're very happy to have him here today. His studies started at Western Kentucky University, moved on to his PhD at the University of Michigan, and is now professor and director of the Mohammed VI Library at Akhawayn University in Morocco. He has written two monographs, Ibadi Muslims of North Africa, Manuscripts, Mobilization, and the Making of a Written Tradition, which came out in 2018 from Cambridge. And then just last year, The Ottoman Ibadis of Cairo, History, also from Cambridge. I also was tickled to see he has at least 6 articles on Jerba, the island off Tunisia, and its manuscript culture, including his recent piece in the Schoenberg Institute's own manuscript studies, entitled "Exhausting but Not Boring," and after the M-dash, rather exciting. The process and politics of a documentation and digitization project in Jerba, Tunisia. So pick up the issue of manuscript studies from last year or read it online, where it's open access. He's speaking today on migrant manuscripts in the Jebel, Nafusa, Libya. So welcome, Dr.
Thank you so much, and thank you in particular to Len and to Nicholas and to Dot for, I feel especially lucky to be here. This was my excuse to come back to the United States. I haven't had a chance to come back and visit for a few years. And so I was really, really delighted that it was going to be here and with this group who I've already learned so much from and also feel so much affinity with. I mean, the last time I got to talk to somebody about Gephi, for example, I'm looking forward to talking to you about Gephi. And yeah, just a chance to geek out with everybody about fun manuscript stuff. So I'll begin with this image of a colophon that I've been thinking a lot about recently. This appears at the end of an Arabic manuscript in the hand of a man I'm going to talk to you about named or known as Abir Mzabi. And he tells us here in this colophon that he copied the book while he was in a town in what is today central Algeria called Beni Izgin. And this is in the Mzab Valley of Algeria, and he copied it in 1904. So he tells us through his name in the actual colophon that he was not originally from the Mzab, but originally from a place called the Jebel Nafusa in what is today northwestern Libya. And he also mentions in the colophon that he had every intention of going home immediately after finishing this book. But the book itself is today on the island of Jerba in southern Tunisia. So I've been working on and off with Al-Mzabi's small library of about 60 or so titles for a couple of years with my colleagues Mahfoud Dahman and Isa Haj Muhammad. And what we've been trying to do is to document and to arrange its contents. So this past summer, the library was added to a digitization initiative on the island of Jerba, which is a continuation of the one that I had the chance to write an article about with some colleagues from Jerba for manuscript studies. So my basic idea is that through the biography and the geographic trajectory of this collection and its owner, the Al-Mzabi library has had me thinking a lot about movement and circulation, and so it seemed serendipitous that I was asked to join you for this. And I wanted to share this idea with you to bounce it off of you and to see what you think. So the Mzabi library is part of a book project of mine on the history of the Jebel Nafusa region in northwestern Libya, and especially of its Ibadi community. And if you have not encountered Ibadis before, they represent a tradition in the history of Islam that makes them distinct from Sunni and Shiite Muslims. So that is the easiest sort of introduction to Ibadis. And it's one of many collections that belong to Ibadi Muslims from the Jebel Nafusa that I've been thinking about using a heuristic that I'm calling migrant manuscripts. So I'm going to begin by explaining what I mean by that, and then try it out, if you like, on the Mzabi library, and then see what you think. And my basic idea is I want something that will allow me to think about the history of migration and movement that characterize the history of the owner, the life of the owner, the history of his manuscripts, the colonial context in which the two operated and were formed, as well as this most recent chapter of digitization. So I suppose what I'd like to know from you is all of this just very obvious, or is there some way that I can make it, as a heuristic, a bit more rigorous? So let me begin by explaining why migrant manuscripts. So I'm using this phrase in two interrelated ways, but very much distinct. So on the one hand, these are manuscripts of migrants, in the sense of scholars or students like Ali al-Mzabi that I'll talk about in a moment, who are copying and using them while on the move from Jebel Nafusa. And the reason that this is especially important to me is because the vast majority of Nafusi libraries, or those associated with this area that I've looked at, have been located outside of Nafusa. So they sort of have movement built into them. And for me, this movement across space is also constitutive. It's really that flow of people among the different sites that give shape to an Ibadi Muslim tradition, as well as an Ibadi Muslim manuscript tradition in North Africa. But so too are the manuscripts themselves migrants, and here's the second meaning of migrant manuscripts, and this very much fits, I think, with much of what we've heard about today. And the books move with their copyists, and even when their copyists have long since disappeared, manuscripts continue to move, whether across these really great distances or just circulating among the hands of individuals at an institution. And thinking of these dual meanings of migrant provides me with this, as I said, heuristic for understanding how people and manuscripts work in concert to produce a manuscript culture for Ibadis, or perhaps more appropriately, how Ibadi manuscript culture, or manuscript cultures in general perhaps, are the crisscross circulation of people and manuscripts, which again, I think is something that fits very well with the conversations we've been having about today. Okay, so let me switch back to Al-Mzabi and to our colophon here. So it wasn't actually until much later in life that this guy, Ali al-Mzabi, becomes known by that name. The name that he signs his manuscripts, including the one that you see here with, includes two parts to his name. One is al-Fursata'i, and the other is an-Nafusi. And what that tells us is that he is, quite literally, the guy from Nafusa. And he could only take on that name because of movement. So he acquires that name after traveling, as I mentioned, to this town of Beni Yezgin in the Mzab Valley in Algeria. Now, in the first decade of this century, of the 20th century, Beni Yezgin is dominated by the presence of a particular individual. This is Muhammad or Muhammad Atfayish, who is this really remarkable Ibadi scholar who himself represents a kind of giant network of manuscript circulation because his correspondence connected him to Ibadi co-religionists across the Maghreb, in Istanbul, in Egypt, in Zanzibar, in Oman, and in Mecca and Medina. It's really an incredible network in and of himself. And Ali al-Mzabi, who is otherwise pretty much a nobody, is connected to this much greater network of circulation of texts through his teacher, Muhammad al-Fayesh. And many of the manuscripts that he copied while he was there are actually authored by this scholar al-Fayesh, and they show up in his private library today. So after he completes his studies, Ali returns to the Jebel Nafusa, but several years later, he and his entire family, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, decide to pack up and move to the nearby island of Jerba in southern Tunisia. So by the time they get to Jerba, they decide to settle with a lot of other folks who are originally from the Jebel Nafusa. This is the map of the island of Jerba. The mainland of Tunisia is that sort of small line in the bottom left-hand corner. And they decide to settle in this town of Ajim. And it was there that he acquired his new nickname, al-Mzabi, the guy from the Mzab. And in Jerba, Ali al-Mzabi would become what is known as a mu'addib or a mu'addib, a Quran teacher. So that's al-Mzabi and his movement and his circulation. What about his library? So not all the items have survived, but as we've seen a few examples of today, there is luckily a hand list of his library's contents, and that's what you see here. This was written in his own hand. It's only the top section of a long double-sided volume. And the things that are in this list are of interest to me and of interest to the theme of circulation for a couple of different reasons. So one thing that shows up a lot in this list are texts that demonstrate he's very interested in classical law, especially Ibadi law. And the other is the omnipresence of several non-Ibadi books. And each of these reflects circulation in its own way. So in the case of the first one, and we've heard a bit about this already today as well, the classical works, so here I'm thinking of works that are mostly from like the 11th to the 15th century, these are copied over and over and over again in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And really the only reason we know anything about medieval Ibadi textual traditions is because of early modern copies. And so there's a kind of circulation built into the presence of these in a 20th century library that I think is really important. And the non-Ibadi books come into Ibadi libraries. This demographic minority community has a bunch of non-Ibadi books because the early modern period is also that in which you have a lot of these guys who are traveling, especially to places like Tunis or to Cairo, which are regional hubs for Islamic learning that are not Ibadi. And so they encounter a bunch of non-Ibadi things and they copy them and they bring them back home and they integrate them into the broader tradition. So even the book list itself has a kind of movement built into it. But the titles in the hand list only reflect the formal composition. So if you were to read through this list, you would imagine that Ali al-Mzabi is a very typical Muslim scholar with an interest in jurisprudence and in theology and Quranic studies and Arabic grammar. But there's a lot of other stuff in the collection. So these are 3 examples of many, many, many fragments that are left in the collection. And these do things like give you advice for how to find gold under the ground, or medicinal cures for various ailments, or guides to understanding the zodiac and the movement of planets and stars and planning your marriage or birth around that, right? And this tells us that al-Mzabi was not just teaching the Quran all the time. Instead, he was administering advice and treatment to members of his community who came to him out of respect as much for his knowledge of astrology and the zodiac as they did of his knowledge of scripture and law. So the materials themselves, though, also say something about circulation. The watermark papers on which many of the materials in this library were copied offer, I admit, few surprises to folks who are familiar with Mediterranean papers. But based on the watermarks, there are Italian, French, and other European papers in the collection, a few of which al-Mzabi acquired, and they're not in his hand and they predate his lifetime. So they're from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. But this also emphasizes for us that he, like his contemporaries, is using paper produced in Europe. The paper is moving around in northern Africa, brought in through port cities circulating throughout the Sahel and in the Sahara and along the coast. By al-Mzabi's lifetime, though, the trajectories of people and paper in this area of the world have been altered significantly by the advent of colonialism. So Ali and his library were formed in a particular historical context in which what have been called colonial regimes of mobility shaped when and how people and their books could move around. So when Ali sets out from the Jebel Nafusa for the Mzab Valley in the story that I told you earlier, his hometown is still part of the green area, which is the Ottoman Empire. But as he sets out for the Mzab Valley, he crosses the border into the Regency of Tunis, which had for 2 decades, by that point, been under the control of the French imperial government or colonial government. And the border, even though it looks like a hard and fast line there, is still very much up for debate at this point, and it's actually really porous. So people can still move across it, but that won't stay the case forever. And when he continues on to the Mzab Valley, he's entering a different kind of colonial space. Because since the early 1880s, the French had exercised military control over the Mzab. And colonial officials had actually been studying the same Ibadi manuscripts that Ali would study, both the medieval ones and the more recent ones, in an effort to better understand the history of Ibadi Islam and to use it to more effectively control the people in the area. And this would actually directly inform colonial policy, not just in this area of Algeria, but in other parts of Algeria as well. So to give you a kind of concrete example of this, this is a bibliography of works from Mzabi Algerian private libraries that was published in 1885. And when I say bibliography, I don't mean printed books. These are actually lists of manuscripts from private libraries that the awesomely named, kind of unbelievably named Gustav Adolf de Calasanti Motolinsky, who was a military interpreter, as you can see there at the bottom, for the French colonial government. He would access these libraries. Precisely how, I can't tell you, but my guess is there was a bit of force involved. And he became not just a bibliographer of these collections, but also a collector himself. And so many of his manuscripts today exist in different parts of the world. There's one up at Columbia, and there's a bunch of them over at Lviv. There are a few at Krakow. So they've spread out through their own interesting provenance stories. So on the material level, though, and this is also, I think, interesting to point out, Ali would have copied his medieval texts on watermarked, usually machine-made paper that was produced in France or in Italy, imported by this colonial government for use in its administrative offices. So what you see on the right-hand side is one of his books with this watermark, and the same watermark is all over the Tunisian National Archives colonial era documents. And so it's clear that the paper is coming into Tunisia and into Algeria for one purpose, colonial documents, and it's making its way onto the market for other people to use for very different reasons. So when Ali finally departs the Mzab to head home, he would return with his books to the Jebel Nafusa, but he would do so at a pretty decisive moment in the history of North Africa. You'll notice that the color of the map has changed on the right-hand side, and that's because in 1911, the Italians would declare war on the Ottoman Empire and invade Tripoli. And one of the things that would happen is that many thousands of people would be displaced from the Jebel Nafusa, where he is from, and would move to different places. And books, too, would be displaced, including a pretty important collection of Ibadi manuscripts that are now located in the University of Naples, Orientale, where they would become central tools for Italian Orientalist scholars who, like their French counterparts, wanted these manuscripts so that they could more effectively understand the people under their colonial control. So this is just a stamp from one of those. I didn't have a very good picture for you, I'm sorry. As for the people, the Nafusis who fled their homeland, many would migrate into southern Tunisia. And I suppose it's probably pretty clear why, if you live right there, you might decide that the next best place to be is just right there. And that's exactly what they do. And the French, for geopolitical reasons, are very much interested in welcoming all of these people who are opposed to Italian colonial rule into their own colonial dominion. So It was sometime in the decade and a half after the Italian invasion that Ali and his family decide to leave the Jebel Nafusa and migrate with the books to the island of Jerba, which, as I mentioned, is largely under the control of the French colonial government at the time. So Ali would travel, his entire family, his books, and of course now he has his new nickname. And his new nickname would in time become the legal name of his children and grandchildren, because now under the French colonial government, you don't just have a nickname, you need a legal name that we can put down on all of these note cards and then all of these documents. And that turns out to be al-Mzabi. And one of the ways that we know that through the books themselves is because the new ownership statements that are on a bunch of the books written in his son's hand, like this one, in this case, this is a lithograph, not a manuscript, but the same thing is true of many of the manuscripts. He signs this as Ramadan, son of Ali al-Mzabi. So no longer a Nafusi, no longer the guy from Nafusa, but now the guy from Mzab. My point here being that there's this kind of assemblage of colonial history that has to be accounted for, I think, if I'm trying to understand the history of this library, that if I were to ignore it, I would miss a big piece of the puzzle, but also a really fundamental aspect of how the library has been formed and moved through time. So the final thing that I wanted to share with you is adding sort of one more chapter to the social life of the al-Mzabi collection that I think deserves inclusion here, since it marks a new kind of circulation. So in the summer of 2024, that is just a few months ago, the latest iteration of a project in Jerba to document and to digitize private libraries began with the al-Mzabi collection as its pilot. So our inventory that we worked on was revised. The items were arranged and given inventory numbers. And the team in Jerba is actually currently working on creating digital facsimiles of the entire library. And this, in time, will allow users anywhere in the world, in theory, to access these items through the British Library's Endangered Archives portal. And this is a project run by my colleagues Ali Boushdidi and Zohair Taghlit in Jerba, as well as an amazing team of folks who are doing the cataloging itself. And this all sounds really wonderful, and it is for people like me and many of you I now know who work a lot with digital facsimiles for all of the many reasons that we might need to or want to do that. But I also realize that this audience, and in particular this institution, is very familiar with some of the potential problems or at least issues that need to be taken into consideration when it comes to digitization. So that's not just questions of quality of images and metadata and accessibility, but also things like consent and the politics of digitization in the first place. And it's a fair and legitimate question, as I've been asking and thinking about with several of you today, who benefits from such digitization projects in this context, right? So when it's happening in somewhere like southern Tunisia and not here in Philadelphia. And I suppose a related question is who benefits, or how much circulation of these texts is actually happening, versus in theory, how much could be happening. So while in theory anyone could have access to these images, there's one particular group of people who are interested in them, and those are other Ibadi Muslim researchers in the Mzab, in Jebel Nafusa, and in other centers of Ibadi learning today, like the Sultanate of Oman, which is where the world's majority of Ibadi community lives, as well as diaspora communities in Paris or Lyon or Montreal. And the digitization process introduces this kind of new route to this centuries-old circuits of movement along which these Ibadi texts move. And through this portal, through the EAP portal, through the British Library, Ibadi scholars in the Mzab working on documenting, for example, private libraries in their own context now have access to tens of thousands of images and can triangulate student relationships and transcription histories and provenance data in ways that were much more difficult to do previously. So those are all wonderful things. There are, however, some hurdles to access. One is a kind of basic one, which is related to Latin script and English interface. So the British Library's website, surprise, is in English. And I should say, though, that the EAP team, which is an awesome team of people, and it's a very small but dedicated group of people. They've spent a ton of time over the last couple of years introducing Arabic script metadata so that people can begin to search these things. But there are still limitations to how much they can do as a small team. And while the teams that are digitizing these materials have spent a ton of time and a lot of effort to digitize them, they're usually not specialists in manuscripts or in the Ibadi tradition, and so sometimes metadata can miss some key elements that make finding particular items really difficult. So you probably, as a user, still have to invest a whole lot of time in looking through individual items. So we were talking before about the example of a composite manuscript that if you're not familiar with what that is, you may never make it to the middle of the book, right? And I'm sure that this is something that all of you have encountered many times before in classic print catalogs, so it's not a new problem. But more basically, and this is part of what I was getting at with the politics of this, is that if the Ibadi community in Ali al-Mzabi's homeland of the Jebel Nafusa in Libya wanted to access these images, they may encounter a lot more trouble for different kinds of reasons because of Libya's ongoing struggle simply to keep the power on, let alone have access to high quality TIFF images that are stored online and take a few seconds to download, even with the best of internet connections. So to sort of bring things to a close, I want to emphasize that this heuristic of migrant manuscripts has really convinced me that human connections alone would not succeed in the long term, I don't think, in creating a durable Ibadi Muslim tradition, or any tradition for that matter. And I had a chance, as I know many people have, a couple of days ago when I got here a bit early, I was able to visit the books exhibit, and it resonated a lot with me about how I've been thinking about the Mzabi collection, and because what we might normally call social relationships, right, dissolve with all of us, but then live on through a combined set of mediators like friend and family relationships or shared rituals, and of course, books themselves. And each in turn shapes the other, and this is the other thing that I think is wonderful about the exhibit, is that humans copy books, but then the script shapes how we can or cannot read them, the material form of the book dictates how we can or cannot use it. And so the idea that I've been playing with and I was reminded of was this study from about 30 years ago by Bruno Latour of the Berlin key. And he has this wonderful phrase where he says, it's because the social cannot be constructed with the social that it needs, in his case, keys, but in my case, books, right? So the point being that the social relationships in the classic way that we think about the social won't do anything in the long term. You need other ways of thinking about social that extend beyond people. And so it's through this interrelated circulation of books and people that a manuscript tradition is constituted. And this, for me, is especially clear in the lives of Jebel Nafusa's migrants, like Ali al-Mzabi, and their books across the past century and a half. So the texts he was copying while on the move himself, then move multiple times. They continue to do so after he or other copyists are gone, creating this dynamic tradition of interwoven textual and human movement. And their movement across generations through that family, through the digitization process that they're going through right now, each of these marks its own kind of twist and turn in this long history of migrant manuscripts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Laura Cleaver, Senior Lecturer in Manuscript Studies at the University of London, who has her PhD from the Courtauld Institute in that same city. Laura's research focuses on medieval illuminated manuscripts of the 12th and 13th century, particularly those in France and England, but especially on their provenance, the trade in pre-modern books in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how this has impacted the formation of libraries and the development of scholarship over the years. She's also the PI and prime mover of the Cultivate Manuscripts project, 2019 to sadly 2024, just wrapped up, funded by the European Research Council, which explores how the trade in medieval manuscripts in the first half of the 20th century affected the development of ideas about the nature and value of European culture. She's hosted a great conference to that effect a couple years ago in London, of which several of the Schoenberg Institute folks were at. She's also been a partner for many years with SIMS, both on our projects and conferences and all manner of things. We've had the pleasure of working with her closely on just a wide range of provenance-related research. And she's fittingly talking today about London dealers and the circulation of medieval manuscripts, 1890 to 1914.
Thank you, Mitch, and I want to add my thanks to Nick and to Lynn for the invitation to be here, and to all the Schoenberg team. As Mitch was saying, we couldn't have done the project that is just wrapping up without you, and it's been an immense joy to work with you on the Schoenberg database and related things over the last few years. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that work, and I think what's really interesting over the course of today is seeing how some themes are coming out in very different case studies. So this is something very different from the last paper, but I think there are points of connection that resonate with what we've been talking about. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of that. So the trade in rare books and manuscripts can be modelled as the movement of books between collectors via dealers. However, the distinction between a collector and a dealer is not as clear-cut as much of the literature suggests. The best-known manuscript and rare book collectors published catalogues of their collections and/or founded libraries to preserve both their books and reputations. The names of such collectors, including people like Henry Yates Thompson, J.P. Morgan, or Henry Huntington, appear in accounts of the provenance of individual volumes that they owned. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some manuscripts spent as long or longer in a book dealer's stock. And this is usually not explicitly recorded in a volume's history. Some books were simply not sold, but others circulated, being sold to clients and then repurchased by the same dealer when that customer's library came back to market. So instead of my initial picture of a one-way stream of collector, dealer, collector, when we actually start to dig into this, we find that things move from collector to dealer and back again in much more complicated ways. Moreover, some dealers wrote of themselves as collectors. The London bookseller Bertram Jebel, who also wrote some interesting poetry, it's not my taste, but it's very much of its time, lamented the fact that at his death he would be separated from his beloved books, while the famous London bookseller Bernard Quaritch presented himself as a collector reluctant to part with his manuscripts in letters to an American client, Theodore Irwin. Yet Quaritch's will made clear that all manuscripts and books printed before 1750, including those that might be at his home at the time of his death, were in fact part of his business stock. While Jebel and Quaritch treasured some volumes, for other dealers, stock that did not sell was a problem, an investment that was not bringing a return. Booksellers often sent manuscripts that had been in stock for years to auction, with or without reserve prices, listed as other properties. If the books did not sell or did not reach their reserves, they returned to the dealers. But sometimes another bookseller was persuaded to take them and try their luck. In addition, manuscripts that had appeared repeatedly in one bookseller's catalogues sometimes then turn up in another dealer's advertising, suggesting that books are moving quietly and often in poorly documented ways between dealers. So over the last 5 or so years, the Cultivate Manuscripts project funded by the European Research Council has worked with the Schoenberg database of manuscripts to produce a granular account of the movement of pre-modern manuscripts between about 1900 and 1945. And in the process of doing that, much of what we've done is to add unpublished sources to the database. Here are a few, because these have turned out to be really rich sources of information, shedding light on the roles that the trade played in the formation of libraries. And one of the big things that we found is that dealers played a really crucial part in not just facilitating the practicalities of moving books around, but in suggesting books, in knowing who's got what, and in manipulating the market to send books in particular directions. And in this paper, I'm going to use those booksellers' records and related materials to explore some of the circumstances in which books moved between dealers, and to reconstruct some of the circulation of books within the trade and further afield between about 1890 and the start of the Great War in 1914. Some of these dealings were recognised at the time as dubious and occasionally even illegal, providing further reasons why they've been obscured. Nevertheless, dealers' willingness to buy and preserve particular manuscripts over long time periods has played a crucial role in their survival. And patterns in the collaborations between booksellers illuminate the networks through which manuscripts moved, often to arrive in the libraries where they're still to be found today. The book-selling firm Alexander Denham and Co. is now not well known, so you can feel smug if you've heard of these guys before. But the case of Frederick Denham provides insights into the ways in which dealers extended credit to one another while trading books. Following the death of his father, Alexander, in 1902, Frederick Denham and his brother Waring took over the family business. The Denhams were Americans, but traded principally in London, exporting many manuscripts to the United States. On the 18th of December, 1902, Frederick Denham visited Quaritch's shop, then in Piccadilly, and told the manager, Edmund Dring, that he had an American client looking to buy first and second folios of Shakespeare. It was agreed that Denham could take a second folio, priced at £720 on a sale or return basis. If Denham sold the book, payment was to be made to Quaritch within a month. However, instead of taking the book to a collector, Denham went up Shaftesbury Avenue to Frank Sabin's shop, where he offered him the second folio. Sabin wrote a cheque for the Shakespeare and two manuscripts, which sort of appear out of nowhere in the record, for £400, which Denham promptly cashed. So it's unclear where the manuscripts came from, but as we'll see, Denham had manuscripts in his own stock, so that may have been where those originated. When testifying, Sabin stated that, "I think Denham intimated that he wished to repurchase all the books. I do not think he went so far as to say he had the right, but I think he suggested 10%. Denham attempted to repurchase the books the following morning with a cheque for £405, 10 shillings and sixpence, giving Sabin a quick, small potential profit. However, Sabin wasn't in the shop, they couldn't do the deal, so after Christmas, Denham returned to confirm the repurchase of the books for £440. Sabin did not immediately realise that Denham didn't have enough money in the bank to cover his cheque. So while Sabin thought the matter was settled, Denham took the Shakespeare around the corner to Walter Layton's shop in Brewer Street to repeat the trick, now agreeing to sell it for just £350, with the right to buy it back for £400 in 10 days' time. Layton reported that Denham said he wanted to complete a large purchase of, I think, illuminated manuscripts. So, who needs Shakespeare when we can buy illuminated manuscripts? That both Sabin and Leighton were willing to agree to the arrangement suggests that it was not an uncommon way of resolving short-term cash flow problems. Denham again attempted to repurchase the books, but Leighton this time demanded cash, noting that a previous check had been dishonoured. Indeed, none of Denham's checks were good, and on the 24th of January 1903, he filed for bankruptcy, owing Sabin £1,735, Bernard Quaritch £994 10 shillings, Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge £3,621 1 shilling and 7 pence, and another auctioneer, Hodgson and Co. £2,800. Such large amounts of credit were not unusual. In 1888, Bernard Quaritch had reported to his son that he owed £24,000, but was owed £13,355 by others, and that the business done in 1887 had amounted to £58,700. So there's a lot of this going on. Quaritch's arrangement with Denham is a reminder that debts could be in money or books. Nevertheless, while high levels of credit seem to have been common, Denham's actions were illegal, and he was convicted of obtaining a book by false pretenses and of disposing of it otherwise than in the ordinary way of his trade, and sentenced to 9 months of prison. When he gets out of prison, he comes back to America, where he disappears, so presumably he starts a new life under another name, but he's yet to be found. Frederick Denham's bankruptcy also impacted less visible members of the trade, who straddled the hypothetical line between dealer and collector. In January 1903, Sidney Cockerell was working as a broker for several manuscript collectors, as well as collecting for himself. And he reported to the American Harold Pierce, "The failure that I referred to yesterday, unfortunately one of your countrymen, Denham, is so disastrous for me that I've had to take my vellum Dove's Press books, including the Agricola, to Sotheby's. And other things must follow very soon." He went on to explain, it is Denham, the bookseller over here, for whom I've been buying manuscripts, which he has had and which I shall have to pay for. In April 1902, at the sale of Henry White's library at Sotheby's, Cockerell had bought manuscripts, including a 13th century copy of Sallust's work for £5 5 shillings, a 14th century volume of Horace's works, also for £5 and 5 shillings, a 14th or 15th century volume of Plutarch for £16 10 shillings, this 15th century copy of Gregory of Rimini's commentary on the Pauline epistles for £19 and 10 shillings, now at Yale, and a 12th century lectionary for £49. These were then listed in Denham's catalogue at a big markup. £5 5 shillings becomes £18 10 shillings, or £7 10 shillings for the second one. £16 10 shillings becomes £38 15 shillings. £19 10 shillings becomes £32, and so on. And the lectionary for £49 becomes £105. So what we might call optimistic pricing by Denham at that point. And these might have been some of the books that then turn up in the bankruptcy mess. Cockerell had also bought for Denham at other sales that year. And like Denham, Cockerell was enmeshed in a web of credit. He reported that my actual out-of-pocket loss by Denham's failure, apart from commissions, is about £1,100. I've already paid half of this by selling out what little stock I had, and for the remainder I shall not be pressed just yet. £340 is due to Sotheby and Co, and as they are fellow sufferers, they are able to sympathise with me. By February 1903, Cockerell was also hopeful that I might get out of the difficulty without sacrificing my manuscripts or any of the irreplaceable Morrisiana. His letters demonstrate that the transatlantic market for rare books and manuscripts was tight-knit, with dealers, auction houses, and brokers all relying on the movement of books and the extension of credit to one another. Quaritch's trade books further demonstrate that trade between dealers and sale and return arrangements, in addition to sending books for inspection prior to purchase, were common at the turn of the 20th century. In September 1899, Quaritch sent a printed Book of Hours and a volume of Ptolemy to Leo S. Olski in Venice, with the entry annotated, and this is at the top on the right there, it is to be distinctly understood that the depot is for 6 months only. This was followed by a list of books deposited with Olski the previous year, which included 2 manuscript books of hours, indicating that books could in fact remain with another dealer for long periods of time. And Quaritch eventually Olski eventually paid Quaritch for the books of hours in May 1900. So he'd had them for a good couple of years at that point. Perhaps the best known, most infamous relationship trading between book dealers is the infamous ring. In this practice, dealers agreed not to bid against one another for books, thereby securing them for low prices. They then staged their own auctions, known as revisions or knockouts, to establish what they thought a book was really worth and divide any profit or loss amongst themselves. This was not illegal. It is now, but it wasn't then. But it was recognised as unethical, both within and outside the trade. And unsurprisingly, the activities of rings are rarely documented, but we've turned up a few choice pieces of evidence in the last few years. So one of those appears in the correspondence between Bernard Alfred Quaritch and the Parisian book dealer Edward Rahier at the time of the sale of Robert Hoe's library in New York in 1911. Quaritch undertook to bid for Rahier, save them both making the journey, and Rahier instructed him, which is what you've got on the screen here, I will also indicate to you my approximate estimation, and you can act, even with revision, with your colleagues, to try to obtain for me the lots indicated. Naturally, you would not have to reveal our agreement. To which Quaritch replied, it is quite possible that there may be a revision. If it is found that it is not advisable to have it in New York, we may have one in Europe after our return. If it is so, do you wish me to have a revision of your books or not? Or do you prefer that they are bought outright in the sale room? The European dealers were unfamiliar with the practices of the American trade, and this seems to have prompted caution on Quaritch's part. He informed Rahier that the law in America, I believe, is very severe against revision. Nevertheless, the potential financial advantages meant that he intended to do it anyway. However, at the sale, the American dealer, George D. Smith, attracted headlines by paying high prices, mostly on behalf of Henry Huntington. Smith later claimed that when he went to London in the following years, he smashed the London ring by refusing to participate in it, but the European booksellers continued their practice. Earlier in 1911, the London bookseller Bertram Jebel had recorded a similar impression that the behaviour of rings was not entirely above board. His diary for the 25th of January 1911 noted, again at Hodgson's, bought only one considerable lot, a book of hours, for £23 10s, but parted with it immediately afterwards. A good deal of dodging about after the sale, but I was well satisfied at the finish. Exactly what he means by dodging about becomes clearer from later entries. After disagreements, in March, Jebel decided to leave the ring. And at a sale at Sotheby's on the 17th, which is what you've got there, he says that he opposed the ring steadily all through and made a very great difference to them, probably £150 to £200 on the day's sale. By bidding prices up to what he was actually prepared to pay, Jebel forced others to pay higher sums. His purchases on that occasion included this 14th century copy of Richard Roller's Prick of Conscience for £37. A few days later, back in the diary again, he described an extraordinary day, bought at Hodgson's nearly £300 worth of books at the round sale, and at Christie's £88 6s. They are all evidently very anxious to make peace with me, but I will see them damned first. I love that he also censors his own diary. It's really Jebel's account suggests both that collaboration was widespread in the trade and that a disgruntled dealer could have a significant impact on profits. Jebel's diary is an important reminder that not all dealers participated in rings, and not all of them participated all of the time, although the practice was common. It's hard to know how much impact this had on the trade in pre-modern manuscripts, which were a small part of the overall book trade, and as unique items were harder to assign economic value to, but there is no reason to believe that manuscripts were not involved. Leighton's stock books demonstrate that some manuscripts purchased by that firm were quickly transferred to other dealers, including people like James Tregaskis and Maggs Brothers, apparently for cost price, which is suspicious. Among the manuscripts bought by Leighton at the Henry White sale in 1902, that sale when Cockerell was buying for denim and never going to get paid, but he didn't know it yet, was this 13th century Bible, for which, as you can see, Leighton paid £100, passing it on to Maggs at cost price, who then advertised it for £180. This was later owned by Leo Olsky, who sold it to J.P. Morgan, and it's now, as you can see, in the Morgan Library in New York. £100 was not a small sum, but the significant increase in the asking price suggests that dealers may have collaborated to try and maximise their profits. Yet while some dealers worked together, Leighton sold other manuscripts to other dealers for profit, and these included Olsky, to whom, for example, Leighton sold manuscripts shortly after Henry White's sale for prices between those he had paid at the auction and those advertised in his catalogues. Leighton was also selling to Wilfrid Voynich, put this in for you, Lisa.
Thank you.
A dealer now best known as the owner of the famous Voynich manuscript, written in cipher. If you want to know more, ask Lisa later. But this was in his stock for more than 2 decades. So he genuinely was the owner for this, even though it was theoretically for sale for all that time. Voynich started trading in London in the 1890s, but rarely bought at auctions, perhaps because he was unable or unwilling to participate in the ring. Nevertheless, Voynich managed to grow his business, in part by placing manuscripts from other dealers' stock with his clients. So, for example, on the 4th of February 1909, he bought a 15th century manuscript containing medical texts from Leighton for £25. This was a discount on Leighton's sale price or catalogue price of £30, but a good profit for Leighton on a book that the firm had bought in 1898 for £10 and 10 shillings. The manuscript was entered into the Wellcome Library's accession register 4 days later, with Voynich now paid £35. So Voynich had made as much profit from the book in a few days as Leighton had made in a decade. And if you look at Wellcome's online catalogue, you will simply see that it was in the Phillips sale at Sotheby's in 1898, with no reference to either Leighton or Voynich. So these cases demonstrate the range of scenarios in which manuscripts move between dealers at the turn of the 20th century and the grey area between dealers and collectors. While some dealers, including George D. Smith, there he is, fetching hat, and Bernard Alfred Quaritch, were primarily interested in books that could be traded. There's lots of evidence from both of them basically saying we don't really care about books, we're just in it for the money. Other dealers, including, as we've seen, Bertram Jebel and Bernard Quaritch, sometimes presented themselves as collectors. At the same time, somebody like Sidney Cockrell was beginning to build a private library at the same time as buying for other collectors and for dealers. So what are the consequences of expanding our notion of collectors to include dealers, whose ownership of books is marked by penciled price codes rather than book plates? The result is to significantly increase the number of large manuscript collections in the early 20th century, in a way that helps to rebalance the traditional emphasis on a small number of very well-known, very rich collectors, many of whom focused on illuminated manuscripts in good condition. Some of you may be grumbling that I've shown you relatively few images of manuscripts in this talk, and that's because most of the examples that I've wanted to show you that spent long periods in dealer stock are either now impossible to trace, or I know where they are, but there are no easy digital images of them, which come back to points that people have already made about the selective nature of digitization. So this is probably because they have limited decoration, they may be in poor condition, or simply that there's a lack of scholarship on them. So all these things interrelate. And the larger category of collectors, if we include these sorts of people, foregrounds the tension in collecting between a cultural appreciation of books and their economic value. Booksellers took risks in investing in and preserving material that might or might not be resold for profit, and much of their collections were books that no one else was prepared to pay market prices for. While rich collectors sought to establish a reputation for taste and judgment through building libraries of books of acknowledged importance, for booksellers, a reputation for being able to identify and purchase such books was intertwined with their own financial survival. As we've seen, booksellers collaborated to try and minimize the financial risks of their trade. In addition to the activities of the ring, extending credit to one another allowed them to maximize the potential for manuscripts to be sold for large profits, which might be divided between several dealers. This in part was the result of control of lists of clients with whom individual dealers had built relationships, but it also exposes networks within which different booksellers collaborated. And these are areas that I suggest would benefit from further research, so I offer them here as starting points for discussion. Thank you. Are we going to go sit?
Paul, if you want to come up, we can take questions. Lisa is chomping at the bit. I don't know, Sean, do you? Yeah. Lisa's. The table's also been fixed.
Is it a Voynich question?
Sort of. Voynich adjacent. Thank you both so much. So yes, Laura. So first of all, I'm so grateful to you for digging into this hidden component that shows just how complicated and kind of shadowy all of these transactions are when you start digging into them. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit to how it strikes me that Derici muddies these waters a little bit in the census, because he includes the Millards in Southern California and Voynich in the census as if they were collectors, even though what he's actually showing you is like a snapshot of what they owned the day he visited them, right? And I'm not sure what kind of insight that gives us, but it does strike me that it is a little bit of a window into this. I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, that's a really helpful example that I hadn't particularly thought about, but it shows us again that we have some people who are just trading. Derici doesn't go around everybody's shop and do that, but there are these people that he thinks of as significant enough or that have a reputation as collectors that justifies their inclusion. And the Millards have started out as collectors and then moved into dealing, and this is a Cockerell is the example that I picked, but there are lots of people actually who are doing this. Some very rich English people, both industrialists and minor aristocrats, are also trading and collecting, but are presenting themselves to the world primarily as collectors. And De Ricci himself is an interesting example of somebody who is buying more than I think has been realized, and he doesn't want to promote himself as a collector, but is certainly doing a lot of dealing for other people, sometimes getting into trouble. There are some nice letters at the Rosenbach where one of the big London auction houses writes to Rosenbach and says, you really, you have to be careful. You shouldn't be dealing with this person. He's really dodgy. Doesn't quite explain why, but that sense that there are these people that operate in this grey area, which is crucial for keeping it all moving. And whose status, some of them have passed into history as important collectors, and some of them have kind of just disappeared. But if we're going to look at the whole circulation, then we need to factor these back into the picture.
Thank you both. I'm interested in provenance, chain of ownership, and the colonial, more than ghost, that's hovering over all of this. Many Islamic manuscripts make their way west in your time and in your presentation. And I'm just wondering, for those that are involved in buying and selling them, to what extent they are thinking about, is there any concern about how they got them? Whether they were, how they were a colonial library, an area of Ibadi manuscripts that winds up in Paris or wherever, or in Quaritch, how colonialism shaped the trade and the, it's a cultural transfer, intellectual transfer from North Africa and the Middle East to Western institutions and collectors. And I was wondering if you all could speak more about not so much the fact, but the awareness at the time and what people thought about who owned these things, or their right to them.
I can start if you want to have a think. And I really enjoyed, and Conrad, I can't see where Conrad is, but might want to come in on this as well, because I was really struck by your paper this morning, which is such an important corrective to saying, actually a lot of this material stayed in Asia, in various parts of the Middle East, which is good, because we definitely have overrepresented the European collectors that went round. But I think we saw this morning a manuscript that's now in the Chester Beatty collection. And in 1917, Beatty, who is an American living in London, but America hasn't yet joined the First World War, wants to sit out the First World War, so he decides to go around the world, and he sets off east, and he just avoids places where there are conflict, and he buys things up as he goes, in a sort of very much a sense of a globalizing world where everything is available for commerce, but both the movement networks and the ideas about what you buy are absolutely shaped by where the British Empire has been and what he's got access to. And a PhD student of mine, Karen Winslow, wrote a thesis about collecting Mughal art in this period, where again, she shows that some of it is coming out as a result of where the British have been and what's moving around. But also that sense in which people don't really know what they're buying. There's no scholarship to support what this is. They're buying it for all sorts of reasons. And unsurprisingly, the sources, the primary sources, are riddled with horrific stereotypes of who these people are that are selling them and why they think they're selling them, which tend to resolve around ideas that, we're being ripped off by the locals, but actually we quite like this, so we're benefiting these people by giving them their money, and it's exactly sort of what you'd expect, but there's tons and tons of this material out there. So I want to put that together really with the work that Conrad's been doing and actually think about what this looks like from the opposite position, because I don't read any of the relevant languages, so I've only seen the buyer's perspective on it. I think it's incredibly helpful to have these alternative positions.
I was also immediately thinking of Conrad's presentation from earlier this morning, and it is worth pointing out that at least in the case of the manuscripts that I've been working with for the last few years in places like Lviv or the one in Colombia that I mentioned, those are a tiny, tiny fraction of those that are in existence, and the vast majority of manuscripts actually are still in private libraries in Northern Africa. So it's not a big plunder in the case of the particular corpora that I work with. However, those that did leave, I think, also represent a kind of spectrum of how things leave in colonial contexts, at least in Northern Africa. So I was thinking of this amazingly named Motolinsky character. In his case, his books appear to be contemporary with his time as an interpreter, and they're probably he probably just pays a student to create a copy for him. So that, I guess, is the best case scenario in which somebody is just monetarily compensated to create one, and then they move through interesting routes via World War II, basically, to different parts of Europe. And then next door in Djerba, there's around the same time, a couple decades later, there is an Italian Orientalist who's there to buy manuscripts in theory, and so there are some folks who loan him copies of manuscripts with the idea that he's going to pay someone to copy them, and he just disappears with them. So that's the kind of like the one that you expect, and then there's the far more blatant sort of violent confiscation of manuscripts, which are those that go to Naples, and that's essentially just the Italian army plowing through the area, finding a bunch of books, and there happening to be a very famous Orientalist scholar there, and says, box those up and send them to the Oriental Institute. We're going to take those with us, you know. So there is that long spectrum of ways in which things end up, and then as a result of the accessibility of those that are in European or North American collections, it skews what we think exists versus what actually exists up into the present. And I should say that my Ibadi colleagues have been really valuable for me to correct that, at least for myself, because I think I probably would have understood things quite differently if I had not been given the opportunity to work with them on these hundreds of private libraries that exist. So, yeah, thank you.
Josh, I see you.
Thank you both for your presentations. I think it's fascinating how you're basically talking about the same time frame, more or less, but in North Africa, manuscripts are a very live part of the scholarly culture that are being produced in real time. And in England, they're basically like historical artifacts and valuable financial tokens that can be used for a variety of scams. But my question is for Paul, and I'm thinking about the complexity of this person who's at the core of your presentation, Ali al-Mazabi, and of his motion around the region, his movement, and the way that it affects his identity in terms of his name. Because then, as you said, that's gotten kind of crystallized through the colonial regime of identity documents, and then now you have this digitization project, which is the Mazabi library, but it creates a kind of erasure of his identity as a Nafusi and removes the Jebel Nafusa entirely from what we're thinking about here. So, could you say a little bit more about like why did his name change? Was there just more prestige associated with the Zab Valley in certain circles, or like as he moved around, why was he no longer the guy from Nafusa and now he was the guy from Zab Valley?
So there's actually one of my most rewarding experiences is related to that name change. I mean, rewarding experiences as someone working with friends and colleagues in Djerba. So I was doing a project that I'm still working on, interviewing families that are of Nafusi descent in Tunisia, because I can't do any field work in Libya right now. And so I had been told that there was a family, a Mzabi family, that had origins in the Jebel Nafusa, they think, but they weren't 100% sure. And it just so happened that at the same time we started working on this collection of manuscripts. And so we noticed this guy's name is not Mzabi, it's Nafusi. And so I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to, and I hadn't actually, perhaps foolishly, I just had not made that connection yet in my imagination. But I had sat down with a member of the family, and he was telling us, I think, that my grandfather came here from Libya when the Italians invaded Tripolitania. And as we started talking about it and working out the genealogy of his family, I realized that his grandfather is the brother of Ali al-Mzabi. And so we said, oh my gosh, take out the books that we have. And so we were able to put into this guy's hand a piece of his family's history where he was able to look at it and say, oh wow, so that's why they say that we're originally from Nafusa. And then what his explanation was for the al-Mzabi was because folks connected to the Mzab used to go to the Mzab Valley in Algeria to learn Islamic sciences, and so it was a kind of honorific to say that you had been associated with the Mzab, and so that was their explanation. But what we were able to show them with these colophons was, yes, absolutely, he was in the Mzab. It wasn't just an honorific in the sense that he knew a lot of stuff, and so he got this nickname. He was actually connected to this place as well. And then in talking to other members of the family, we also sort of managed to triangulate a little bit more about his history. But this was one of those few moments where I was able to do something that was of interest to me, you know, as a historian, to work with this collection and help take care of it, and also to give this family something that was useful and fun for them in terms of family history.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you for a fascinating panel. And I mean, just picking up on what Josh said, I think it's really important to remember that most world regions did not adopt movable print until very recently. And so Europe is really the outlier, which took this very weird path, which most world regions don't really understand why they decided to do so. And that print is really a blip in the history of writing for most world regions, in contrast to Europe, which took this particular path. But just Laura on traders. So I think something which is quite interesting for us is that when European traders try to build up manuscript collections in other scripts and languages, often they are not able to navigate that manuscript culture. They're completely lost, they don't have the cultural background, so they completely rely on local middlemen who more or less explain to them, put together, curate a collection of what's the right stuff to have. So Baudelaire's Arabic collection was not built by Orientalist ideas, but by a Sufi sheikh from Aleppo, who basically curated the first collection of the Baudelaire in Oxford. But it seems that for your traders, it's a completely different logic, and that traders do not really play this role of curating the collection of collectors, even though they had them for a long time. So I was just wondering, is that a topic at all in your cases?
Yes, I think they do in some measure curate. They part of what you need to do to be a successful dealer, and there are people here who will know this much better than I do, is to know what people are interested in buying and what they've already got. So what you know, part of, and we've been talking a bit about sort of when does manuscript end? Well, I've shown you manuscripts that are medieval, but also manuscripts that are 20th century. And it's just that we decided that there's a difference in status between the old stuff and the new stuff. Cockerell's letters and Quaritch's trade books, these are all manuscript books, but we give those so little, we have given them so little priority and interest compared to the medieval things that we've decided are important. But it's about knowing what people think are important and being able then to direct and suggest, particularly in the transatlantic trade, where some collectors will come over once a year, once every 2 years, and actually be in the shop and see things. But most of what you're doing is by letter and through catalogues, and is saying, and there are great exchanges of letters between Quaritch and the Morgan Library, where Quaritch will write and say, I'm giving you advance notice, these things are coming in on the market. And somebody like Bell Green will write back and say, nah, we're not interested. And Quaritch will write back and say, but did you see this one, which is very like this thing that you told me 5 years ago you were desperate to have. And so in all those sort of subtle ways, it's about the relationship. And very often then Green will say, oh yes, go on then, you can spend £20,000 on it. Which is a very good day in the Quaritch office. So it's about that. It's not that they are, because with the European stuff, you don't have to go long distances and deal with other people. It's all coming to you in London. That's where the centre of the trade is. So it's about them being able to say, right, I can see that there are medical manuscripts here, and actually the person who's going to buy those is welcome. So let's just make that connection and link those things up and put the right material in front of the right people to get the maximum profit out of it.
Do we have anything from the... Go ahead.
Yes, just to follow up on that, what was the turnaround time? I mean, how long, when would Quaritch receive an auction? How long before an auction would Quaritch receive a catalogue?
Usually the booksellers know a bit in advance of what's coming up, because they're also talking to the auction houses, and they will try and give their clients, particularly their faraway clients, where telegrams and things eventually make it easier. But if you're trying to deal with New Zealand or something like that, it's going to take a very long time to get responses back and forth. So having that edge is part of their advantage. And the auction houses will also be contacting people in advance and say, oh, I've got a collection coming in next spring. You know, when the Mostyn manuscripts come in after the First World War, they write to all the Americans and say, loads of early English print is about to come on the market. You're going to want to be here next summer for this, as far in advance that they can. But the real thing, and that's where the Quaritches and the Jebels who really love these books and make a big deal about themselves as collectors and not wanting to part with them are unusual, because one of the things that we were able to do by looking at lots and lots of this data is to show that things are turning around very, very fast. If a manuscript makes it from purchase into a dealer's catalogue, in some ways that's a failure, because you haven't sold it in the month between those 2 points. And actually, at least half the manuscripts usually are selling within a week of the auction, even if they're not commissions. So the skill is in being able to turn it over very fast, ideally for as much profit. But even if you make 10%, if it only sits on your shelf for a week, that's going to keep the lights on for another week.
Right.
All right, there's a question on Zoom from Tori Johnson. Laura, how did this model of bookselling / dealing fall apart or evolve heading farther into the 1900s?
Yeah. So the reason that I stopped with the outbreak of the First World War is that in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, things are going well. Prices are creeping up for all sorts of material, particularly illuminated pretty books that you don't need to be able to read. You can just enjoy them as art objects. That's all going great. But that really backfires in the autumn of 1914, when suddenly there's a war on, and spending money on luxury goods is deeply unpopular. So the booksellers are in terrible trouble for the first 18 months of the First World War, because you cannot be seen to be doing that. And again, with the Great Depression, not so much in 1929, but by 1931, I've got letters from, again, Burl Green writing to Quaritch. Not that Morgan can't afford to be buying books, but she explicitly says, we cannot be seen to be buying books when there are people literally living on the pavement who haven't got enough food to eat. So there are moments when the trade really gets affected by external events. And that's where the strength of the bookseller is to be able to ride that out by not then parting with your stock at low prices. Particularly through the 1930s, some of them have to do that. Quaritch issues a really big catalogue in 1931 of illuminated manuscripts, and many of those are still in stock into the mid-1940s. But it's a sign of the strength of the business that they can hang on to them and ride it out and wait for the market to recover.
Any last questions? Let's thank our panelists. And not with the The tour officially begins in 20 minutes, or I don't know, is that right, Nick?
Yes. 20, I need time before, and then I think Nick and I need to touch base about getting it on Zoom too. So at 5 o'clock,
Feel free, I think there's still some
there should
coffee
be,
and
there should
tea,
be refreshments and stuff.
you can come to the
as
Lee
well.
Library.
Basically, there's 5 o'clock, please be there. By the gallery.
Okay. So interesting, and there's so many.
Somewhere there's.
There are things about all of this work that actually transcend time.